This week in the enterprise news, we're going to talk about Security Compass securing a funding round, micro patch that simulates a workaround for the recent zero-day in IE, a new Kaspersky Sandbox that automates protection from advanced threats, FireEye adds Cloudvisory to its stable, and some more funding and acquisition from ServiceNow, Sysdig, Waterfall Security Solutions. In our second segment, we welcome Alex Horan, the Director of Product Management at Onapsis, and JP Perez, the CTO of Onapsis, to discuss, well, SAP vulnerabilities, of course, as it relates to SAAP vulns and security. In our final segment, Robert Siciliano, security awareness expert, to discuss security awareness training, empowering employees to care about the security through security appreciation training. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The Viavi Solutions Observer Platform provides SecOps teams a powerful combination of comprehensive data for threat hunting and incident response that includes wire data analytics and enriched flow records. Using pure, unaltered packet and net flow, Observer presents views across the entire IT infrastructure with threat alert features including scope, impact, and advanced traffic profiling. Teams can use automated workflows to dive into high-fidelity network evidence and more quickly resolve issues, minimizing impact on customers, users, and business operations. Learn more about the Viavi Network Security Solution and download free resources at securityweekly.com/Viavi. That's VIAVI. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to episode 169 of Enterprise Security Weekly for January 22nd, 2020. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Mr. Matt Alderman. Matt, welcome.
It's Wednesday already. I can't believe it.
Yes, it is. Quick announcement, join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st at Disney's Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW 2020 and click the register button. We're doing interviews out there and all kinds of stuff at InfoSec World, right?
Yes, we have the Container Summit on that Saturday before InfoSec World starts. We'll have a place to do interviews and recordings. So yeah, we'll be pretty active down there in Orlando. And at the Tiki Bar every night at the Polynesian, just in case you want to know where we hang out.
Yeah, and so if you work for a security vendor and you want to do an interview, you're going to be at InfoSec World. We do have those micro interviews available at InfoSec World. And Matt and I will be talking about container security, which is a hot area of research for myself. Still continuing.
And a lot of funding and acquisition announcements that cover the container space as well today. So,
yeah, it's interesting. No, I don't have another announcement, but there's a lot of tools out there that try and make it easy for you to deploy containers and serverless too, right? But it's that balance, Matt, of control versus usability and easy to deploy, right? So you can, stand up stuff in like Beanstalk, or you can stand up stuff in all these other Amazon services, like Lightsail was one. You can get pre-built AMIs, but you lose a lot of the controls, I feel like. Whereas I'm actually on using ECS and using EC2 to deploy into ECS. Because I feel like before I can use some of the tools we'll talk about today, right, for orchestration and deployment and monitoring, I have to understand how it's done, like from a earlier stage with a lot more configuration options. I feel like EC2 with ECS is a pretty good place to start doing that, right?
You can, or EKS is the other version of that, right?
Yeah,
which is the Kubernetes-based version. So
right, and so what I realized is that ECS, the Elastic Container Service, is very similar to having an orchestrator like Kubernetes, which you can also get in Amazon's cloud. Google's offering, of course, is very much based on Kubernetes because they developed it, and Microsoft has a Kubernetes deployment. Correct.
GKE in Google, and it's AKS, I think, in Azure.
Yeah. But and again, to get to some of the stories, there's a lot of complexity in deploying all these, deploying your app, and there's a lot of gotchas. Like you go down a path. I'm going to choose these services and this way to deploy, and you realize that if you need storage, how you do that is very different depending on which path you've gone down, right?
Yes.
So that's one of my more recent observations.
Yeah. Storage is always an interesting one when we talk about containers, containerization, cloud native, because it's really not, you're not supposed to take a SQL database and throw it in a container per se. I mean, you can,
but people do that. So that's a great point, Matt. I'm a huge fan now. Like if your app has a database and you're deploying in AWS, you should just be using RDS. And I know it's more expensive, but it's going to save you a lot of headaches down the road, I think.
Because databases aren't really immutable per se, right? You can think about a lot of your other services
as immutable
in a cloud native environment. Is immutable. I can spin it down and throw up a new one and I'm good. You can't do that with your database. So there's a level of persistence with data in the database that has to be factored into a cloud native architecture. And in doing it as a SQL server in a container may not be the best approach, where I can leverage a service that's always there, always gives me that persistence of my storage. That might be a better option.
Now it is cheaper, but then you have to factor in a lot of other things: performance, encryption, backups,
recovery.
And when you're doing backup and recovery, what I like about RDS is if you create a VPC with multiple subnets, it'll do that high availability backup and restore and all that stuff, right? So it like flips. I saw something about that briefly. Like it needs multiple subnets to be available all the time, even when you're doing maintenance, which I thought that's a huge benefit, right? The fact that it's backed up, you don't have to worry about it. And if you build large enough instances of RDS, you can also do encryption at rest. That's a bonus, right? But that costs, like the smallest image I think I can get on RDS is like $100 and change a month. So there is a cost.
And then you throw in your HSM so you can do encryption at high speed because you don't want to take a performance hit with encryption. That adds to your cost. We were talking about this on Monday on Application Security Weekly, actually, with
you
Mike
just
and
start
John.
adding on all these services. Like load balancing was another one. I'm like, wait a second, I don't need load balancing right now, but a lot of the tutorials have that in there as well.
Yeah. But we were talking through all the performance potential impacts and the cost to get your performance back.
Right.
Those are all things you have to weigh when you're thinking about database encryption and encrypting your data at rest.
Yeah. Some interesting stuff. I'm excited. It's like I'm learning a whole new...
You're a kid in a candy store.
Yeah, it's a whole new game and everything. It's a lot of fun. Security Compass is got some funding. And their website was kind of vague, Matt, as to exactly what they do, how they help organizations. It looks like they have products and services, but it seems to be like basically a linting kind of source analyzer for security was one of the things. They talked about shifting way left in the SDLC, but I don't know.
So if this is the same company I'm thinking of, they've been around for about 15 years. They started more on the compliance side.
Yep.
And it looks like they've made some transitions. Now they're trying to apply, what I gathered from their website is trying to apply policy and compliance requirements into the software development lifecycle from a DevOps perspective. So you see these shifts all the time where okay, I'm doing this thing, and then how do I apply it to something new? And that looks like what these guys have done a little bit is they've taken some of their compliance capabilities, some of their policy stuff, and tried to retrofit it into DevOps. I couldn't get a lot of details on exactly what they do. They have this big thing called SD Elements or something like that.
SD Elements. Yeah, that's the product that I saw too.
And I'm like, okay, I'm not quite sure what that thing all does. So I couldn't get enough details. They took a funding round, but they also reshuffled some management. So this tells me a little bit that there's a little bit of shift in direction. I think with this vendor, some new management came in with the funding round, maybe trying to reinvent themselves a little bit. So we'll see where this goes. But
now, Matt, you've done a lot of compliance work, more than I have. When you've got a DevOps environment where developers can basically code their own infrastructure and deployment, then looking at compliance in that light is a challenge, right? Because there are change control processes most often, right, that have to be in place in order to meet compliance. And that's just one example of a challenge you might have when you're deploying and implementing things completely different today, but still have those compliance standards that you have to remain compliant to.
Yeah, I mean, from a compliance perspective, there's three primary types of controls: management, operational, and technical, right? So you've got, management controls are at the organization. Operational are kind of like all your procedures, processes. Your SDLC processes have to be documented, change control, et cetera. Where things get interesting is on the technical side, and how do you do certain technical control checks along the CI/CD pipeline to validate a level of compliance. And that's where we've seen different tools come in at different places, right? You can do it at source code, you can do it at build, you can do it during testing phases. And so compliance kind of gets, potentially, if done right, I think, kind of gets spread out across different checkpoints in the CI/CD pipeline. And I think that's what they're trying to do here. It's just really hard to figure out what exactly they do versus what some of the other tools that are doing aspects of these checks are also doing.
Right. And, it's interesting, as our listeners know, I'm reading the Unicorn Project by Gene Kim. And I also think that, like, similar to the Phoenix Project, they're very extreme examples of the challenges that you have when you're trying to deploy applications, right? And so in this particular example, they've been burned by a production outage, right? Because developers were able to, push a change that broke something, right? Maybe you've also had a security incident because code is moving out so fast that there was a security incident. And so what happens is you start to regress and go back, where in order to change something in production, in order to get a new environment, in order to get it through QA, in order to get it into production, now there's all kinds of committees and approval processes and tickets and only certain people that can do certain tasks. And now you've gone from being able to deploy once a day to it takes months to get a release out again. Like, you've basically regressed yourself back to waterfall because of incidents that have happened and now controls that you've put in place, even selection of technology. And of course, they show the extreme example in the book. But I think that's where some technology can help us, and that's why I like the CyberArk announcement, which looks like, and some of the problems that they go through in the book is, well, like, I need this credential to get this done, or only that one user is able to make this change and push this piece into production. And so what CyberArk announced, I thought, spoke to that problem. I don't know if their product marketing and messaging is talking about it, but they can use it if they want. They talk about temporary elevation, right? And I can totally see this, right? Like, there's some kind of outage or there's a change that I need to push in, and I don't have the right privileges. But since my code passed QA, security blessed it, it passed all the security checks, you may temporarily elevate my privileges so that I can push that into production, right? Or there may be an ephemeral account that gets created in a CI/CD pipeline to just generate that so it can do its job at a certain time, maybe with a manual, one person going, yep, that's good. And also broker and remove access, right? I may need to SSH and get a shell into something to do something in production. And we've all seen it as pen testers where that stuff gets left around, right? Now you can just broker that access and it goes away. I like these at a high level even to speak to the way that we're deploying infrastructure and applications today.
Yeah, because what happens in a cloud native environment is you explode the number of service accounts you have to manage.
Yeah.
And all those credentials and access points and et cetera have to be managed. If you can provide a way to limit both privileges and time,
yep.
Now what you do is you reduce the attack surface. And when I need escalation of privileges, I get them, but I only get them for a period of time instead of having escalated privileges forever, because that opens an attack window that sometimes you don't see because you've left these highly privileged accounts on all the time. So this is a really great way to limit that exposure for these types of accounts where you need limited, you need some privilege escalation, but you only need them for a period of time and then they go away.
Right.
So somebody can't reuse those credentials and
I like that in the build process too, because I'm trying to reach the point where in production there's no shell access, right? Or via SSH, especially if you're deploying containers, because there doesn't need to be. If you make a change, you should do it in your config and push out a new image. But while you're testing maybe that new image, you might need shell access to get in there and troubleshoot a problem and see what's going on. And I'm trying to put that in the development process, but then strip it out as it goes to production. And in all these different configurations, that's going to obviously look different in your config. And I still think some of those things that might elude some people as they build their CI/CD pipelines, having very different configs for development, QA, and production, because it changes the environment too. So then, how do you got to test at each stage? So there's some nuances there. And some people have figured it out, and that's awesome. But I still think it's something that people struggle with, Matt.
Yeah, because all the infrastructure you deploy is really done via code, and it's all configuration files. And a lot of people don't have good visibility into those configuration files, so they don't know what's in those until after it's spun up.
Right.
I'm starting to see solutions come onto the market to really address this. A lot of the solutions have dealt with this at the runtime side of gaining access to your cloud environment, looking at all these different checks. But by then, it's a little late because you're already running in production.
Yep.
If I can back that up a step and say, look, I've got all these configuration files that spun all this equipment up in the cloud, can I inspect them beforehand, look for certain anomalies or misconfigurations that would create a security incident in production?
Because I saw an example where they were spinning up AWS infrastructure using Terraform. I was like, wow, that's really cool, right? I'm like, I want to get to that level, like when you're using that in production. And that's not a new product,
no, it's been around for a while. No,
but it's a great example of what you're talking about, right? Before I spin up all my infrastructure with a Terraform, which is basically can go create your entire AWS infrastructure, run it through some checks first, and go, yeah, when this spins up, you're going to have a security hole here, right? It's a good example.
Exactly right. Yeah, and you see it with YAML files, with Kubernetes, and there's a ton of them out there. All of them need to be looked at in some form or fashion because they are literally spinning up and configuring the infrastructure for you.
Yep. All righty. Let's see. So we did Security Compass, CyberArk. Micro patches. I don't know. I would consider I would test this first, Matt, right? I mean, anytime you get a patch that's not from the approved manufacturer, it can be kind of dicey. However, on the flip side, though, as we have progressed through the past, 20 years, there's a lot of folks that have some really in-depth knowledge of Windows, right? I mean, some of the fundamental architectures are very much the same, right? And if you've kept up with it, you can have a pretty good understanding now of the Windows architecture, enough to come up with a patch that maybe Microsoft's not going to come up with, right? And that's exactly what there's a different company.
Acros?
Acros, ACROS provides. They must have their product. I think is called MicroPatch. It simulates the offered workaround from Microsoft, restricting access to the vulnerable JavaScript DLL. This is with the new IE 0 day, without the negative side effects, which are reduced functionality for components or features that rely on that particular DLL. So this company says, I think we figured it out, and here's a patch, and this can be applied. In Windows 7 and 2008, of course,
2002.
Might not get the patch at all. Sounds like their patch then could be applied to those operating systems. If I'm supporting Windows 7, I'm at least testing this, right?
If you're 2008 R2, just move it into Azure and get 3 years of extended support or whatever the announcement was from Microsoft a week or so ago. Windows 7's a lot harder, right? And so maybe this is a workaround for those people that are still migrating off of Windows 7. I'm not sure I'd do this on my server side, but it looks like it works.
Yeah, I mean, the server, well, I mean, it's a browser on the server side too, so that's, that kind of changes it as well. So you're probably safe on the server side if you're not browsing the web from your servers, right? But
yeah, it depends on where else that DLL might be used, though.
It's true. Sure. It's true. Yeah, not just the browser might call it, right? So, yeah, it's interesting if you get it up in Azure, what other compensating controls you could have, right? I mean, I guess you could always just deploy a new one if it gets compromised, but then that's just a cat and mouse game because you don't have a patch, right? So.
Right.
But I mean, I used to really be nervous in the early 2000s when there were companies back then, right? And even independent folks that would publish patches before Microsoft would have a patch available. I think Microsoft has gotten better about out-of-cycle patches, right? But then, 20 years ago or so, I was like, I don't know if I trust it. Today, again, when your infrastructure is more ephemeral, right, and you've got options in the cloud, I would totally do this. Well, and then if you're deploying to end user workstations, then you're kind of screwed because it's not ephemeral. It's on someone's laptop, right?
Right. We used to do the virtual patch, right? You used to figure out what the potential exploit was, and then on your host space, endpoint protection or something like that, you try to put a rule in place that would virtually patch it before you had a chance to patch it. So we saw those typical kinds of concepts over the years. The question is micro patching better than virtual patching? Not sure, because you're actually playing with the DLL where the other one's setting up certain rules to mitigate. But maybe there isn't a virtual patch available for this potential exploit. Therefore, the only route to go is something like this micro patch.
Right. It's actually a nice segue while we're on Windows, talk about StealthBits StealthRECOVER. I think this is a direct competition to it's an Israeli company that does the backups for Windows, AD recovery. I can't think of it now.
Javelin?
No.
It wasn't Javelin.
No, it wasn't Javelin. It was another company. We did a briefing with them. It'll come to me. But basically, we did the briefing. I was like, well, wait, doesn't Microsoft provide like a good way to back up and recover your Active Directory? They're like, well, there's some limitations there, right? And there's a lot more work if you're just native Active Directory, essentially, in limitations. And so it sounds like StealthBits now wants to compete in this market to make it easy for you to back up, right? And one of the issues was, if I remember correctly, it depends on what you're backing up and restoring from and to. If you've got a physical server and then you go, yeah, it's compromised, something really bad has happened, I want to roll back, and I want the new one to be out in the cloud now, like that's not, without third-party software, that was a no-go. So there are, most people have Active Directory, right? It's definitely something to put on your list of things to go talk to your teams about, or if you're on that team, consider what your backup and recovery strategy is, because you probably are going to have to go get some commercial software to meet your requirements in now StealthBits. I'm not sure if they had this or if it's a new version or not, but they play in the space, which is great to have options, right?
Yeah, I guess my curiosity is if you're running AD in Azure, is this backup and recovery kind of stuff taken care of? It's all taken care of for you? And this is only really for the on-prem AD users? That's kind of what I got. I didn't see any support for Azure AD because I don't know if it's required up there.
Right. Simperis was the company, Matt. Simperis. Yeah, but if you want to, in the cloud, in Azure, it might be a lot easier, but there still could be some limitations as there's a bunch of companies, right, that have commercial products that offer above and beyond what Microsoft has. But if you want to go like from the cloud to an on-premise or to another cloud, then you're kind of screwed.
And your host.
Yep. So let's see. Sandboxing. Kaspersky Sandbox is automating protection from advanced threats. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with what Kaspersky is saying here, right? 47% of SMBs, 51% of enterprises say it's more difficult to differentiate between generic and advanced attacks. I think we've seen this trend, right? As I think we get a little better at detection, now we're getting a little more granular, right? And it's easier for us to, I think it's actually easier for us to differentiate between a really advanced attack and a generic attack. And that difference could be, I'm only seeing the generic attacks and I'm not seeing the advanced attacks, right? Because I think we've done a better job at finding the generic attacks, but differentiating between the two, I can see that as a nuanced kind of thing that we maybe not have touched on before. So what Kaspersky is saying is you got to spend a lot more time evaluating all those files, doing the forensics to say, like, is this just something generic that I can tune and tweak a few things, go clean up my systems, and move on with life? Or is this something that's been persisting for a while, it's stealthy, it's covering its tracks, and I have to really investigate, right, to see if there's stealing credit cards or PII or whatever the case may be. And so they're promoting this sandbox as a way to do that, right? Take your malware specimen, send it up to the sandbox, and let it do the analysis for you. I don't think this is a bad idea. However, not all sandboxes are created equal. There's a lot of commercial companies. I really like the folks at VMware. I think they have great technology. Intezer has great technology as well. And there's free ones too, right? So, I mean, you have to do your own risk profile and say, where are we going to start? Now, what's nice is you can always start with a free one, right? You can build the process, you can test it, and use the free one and see what your mileage is. And then that may help you justify to say, hey, we're using this free one, and it seems like, I've done some manual analysis. It's missing out on some of these pieces. Maybe we should go shop around with some requirements and look at other vendors that have sandbox technology. Again, I like the newer startups, Matt, in this space. Not to say Kaspersky is going to do a bad job, but as we've talked about before, these larger security companies have a tougher time innovating unless they're making an acquisition, which we're going to get to in this show. So if it were me, I would heavily lean towards the Intezers and VMwares of the world.
Because this is so 2015.
Yeah.
It's taken Kaspersky 5 years to get to the point where they offer a sandbox, right? And that's why the innovation is actually happening at the startups. It's not happening at the big players. Right. And Kaspersky's one. Plus, Kaspersky has a ton of pressure on them anyways. I mean, we've seen a lot of people move away from Kaspersky because of their relationship to Russia, and so they've got
all the Russian malware in Kaspersky Sandbox gets a big check mark. It's okay. It's totally fine.
It's okay.
It's all good. It's just us. It's cool. I'm not saying they do that. I don't want to imply that, but it was a joke.
But I mean, they have had a lot of issues.
But you're right. They have had
their relationship, and a lot of people have moved away. And now you're bringing in some capabilities that are like probably 5 years old. Probably should have been done a long time ago.
Right. And there was the whole thing with NGINX. As well, to kind of add. I mean, that's not Kaspersky, obviously, but it's in the country that we've had. We've had the U.S. government, right, pull out of Kaspersky and say, no, you can't run that software. So, yeah, there have been incidents. We can't gloss over those. Agreed.
Right.
ServiceNow to acquire Loom Systems. I really like this acquisition, but it's, again, a case where you might want to look at some of the newer startups as well. With RSA, pretty much just around the corner at this point, in Black Hat, it's a good time to start looking at some of this technology. And basically what it boils down to is applying AI/machine learning, and listeners always like to correct us in the usage of those terms, right? I think this falls more in a machine learning style algorithm, right? Because essentially, if you have a ticketing system, you can apply AI might be a stretch, although you don't really know until you talk to the technical people on the design team to see how they've implemented it. But I look at it as just more analytics of your service desk tickets, right? Or whatever help desk ticketing system you're using. You can glean a lot of great information through an analytics engine that says, well, for example, every time we have this particular type of problem, it goes to one of these two engineers, and engineer 1 closes tickets 50% faster than engineer 2, what are they doing differently, and then what can we do to automate this problem so that it doesn't just fall on these two engineers, right? And I mean, we could go on and on about all the different ways you can analyze that data and then take automated actions on it. It sounds like that's what Loom Systems was doing and why ServiceNow acquired them, because it's a shoe-in to fit into ServiceNow's offerings.
Yeah, because they've been working a lot on two major enhancements to ServiceNow, their base ITSM ticketing system. One is GRC side, so they're doing a lot on the governance, risk management, and compliance side, but they're doing a lot on the SecOps side. And so this fits in the portfolio from a SecOps perspective in continuing to figure out how to do more automation in the SOC side of the business, right?
Well, it's also understanding, it's a lot of things we do manually. It's looking for trends in the tickets and going, everyone is filing tickets and they're generally like users requesting this particular thing and someone has to take an action. Well, can't we just write software to allow them to do that themselves, right? But you need to analyze all that data to be able to make those business decisions. It's a great application for machine learning and/or an analytic style approach.
Right, and ServiceNow has already done some really interesting automation around phishing and malware. When we did the survey with them last year, we also saw some of the other use cases that people are going to start looking at. And my guess is Loom Systems actually helps augment some of those other use cases that will allow them to build some additional automation around those standard use cases, just to bring those time windows down, right? Reduce the number of tickets or the steps involved in the ticket. This is where my guess is this integration comes in.
Yeah, and I really think what it says is basically analyze the data and then pick out the things that you can completely automate. And I love this. When we were doing the same thing here at Security Weekly, right? Pick out the things that you can automate so a ticket never gets generated, right? An event happens, an automation kicks off, and that phishing is remediated and it gets added to the block list in the SOAR kind of example. That's everyone should be striving towards it, looking at or implementing that in various scenarios already. A lot of people already do, especially with phishing. I think phishing really benefited from that SOAR market taking automated actions. Let's see.
FireEye acquired CloudVisory.
CloudVisory. What is CloudVisory?
Yeah, so I had to go look them up too, Paul. So they are a cloud security posture management and workload protection vendor. So what the heck does that mean? It's actually taking a couple markets and bringing them together. So we've seen a lot of cloud workload protection platforms, Capsulate and others, right? Cloud Passage are what are traditionally considered cloud workload protection platforms. They're looking at protecting the infrastructure stack for cloud deployment, whether private or public. Then you marry that with what's called cloud security posture management. And this is that kind of real-time look at your cloud configuration and look for anomalies in your configuration. Cloud Needy, Evident.io, Redlock, etc. Those kinds of companies. So what these guys are doing a combination of both of those. So not only are they trying to protect the workload in the cloud, they're also providing some configuration validation, not only to their stuff, but it looks like some other cloud stuff. What I find interesting about this, FireEye hasn't done a lot on the cloud side, right? They've been doing a lot around SOAR and automation operations. And you've seen a lot of the cloud application kind of stuff coming out of Palo Alto Checkpoint. FireEye started to enter into the space, which is a little interesting to see where they take this and what other acquisitions they potentially do, because they're starting to shift in a place they haven't been before. So it was kind of an interesting acquisition.
Were there other? Sysdig closes a $70 million Series E funding round.
Yes.
We didn't cover this one already, did we?
Nope, we have not covered this yet. Yeah. I mean, this is a big... Yeah, I mean, they're $206 million in. I love what these guys are doing. They were a sponsor on Application Security Weekly last year. I actually went out and did KubeCon in Barcelona with them last year and kind of did a one-day container security discussion. They're a really interesting company. They started more on container performance management. They think of APM, right? The traditional application performance management market. They built some capabilities to do that in the container world, and then moved into container security as a kind of a second step. So they've done this really interesting kind of marriage between not only security in the container environment, but also performance. And the data they collect is actually helping both of those use cases. And they talk about that a little bit here in this announcement of kind of how they're bridging that. They also have the open source product called Falco that people can download and use to do some of the security checks in your container environment. So this is great news for them to continue to grow. I do like what these guys are doing.
Fantastic. Waterfall Security also took a funding round as well.
No, this one is really interesting because they don't disclose the amount, and I went to Owler and it's still not listed. And you had Lior on a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, on this show, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Lior's been on before. They haven't taken any funding. According to Owler, they had taken no funding up until this point. So when they say significant, I'm curious what eventually number pops up. It's kind of hard to evaluate what significant means, but it looks like they are getting some momentum for some additional investment. They're in a really interesting space, operational technologies, protecting SCADA and ICS systems. We've seen a lot of activity in that space last year with Tenable's acquisitions, Forescout's acquisition. Dragos continues to raise money and grow. It's just an interesting market, a lot of focus around industrial control systems and operational technology.
Yeah, and I think the geopolitical landscape, for lack of a better term, is certainly driving that, right? As we are talking more and more about protecting our own infrastructure and how our infrastructure becomes more connected, and our ability to protect that also needs to increase. And so we're seeing a lot of activity in this market, I think, because of the things that are happening in the news today, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. Flashpoint had an interesting announcement. Now, I would have thought they would have had this offering already, but maybe it was kind of a spin out from their overall service, Matt. But their compromised credentials monitoring is maybe repackaged so you can get just the credential monitoring. I don't see a reason not to do this. Is some of the feedback I've heard in the past is, folks subscribe to these types of services, not specifically Flashpoint, but these types of services, and there's just nothing like on the dark web about them. And so, but that's good, right? So, I mean, you're paying for the monitoring. That doesn't necessarily mean you are compromised, right? You shouldn't hope that you're compromised and you've got credentials floating around the dark web. But that aside, I think, interfacing with their API, letting them go out and find your credentials that might be out there somewhere. And this is we're not just talking about scraping sources and stuff like that. I think there's different levels, of obtaining that information. Maybe they're posing as pseudo informants or whatever. They're inside some of the dark web, channels, forums or whatever, and they're scraping some of that data, right? And that could be valuable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is they actually created two products out of this. One for the employer to monitor for employee compromise. The second one is to monitor for their customer compromise, right? And if you're in a space where you have a lot of customer data and you're collecting a lot of customer data, you want to know if that data has been compromised somewhere out there and be a little more proactive about trying to resolve it and fix that, because that probably means there was a breach somewhere that you didn't realize you had. So it was just interesting how they broke it into a couple different products to focus on a couple different angles of whether it's internal employees or external customers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is valuable, to be quite honest. And you're going to have to shop it around. Your mileage varies, and of course, there's also free sources out there too. But I think I don't want to say they're going to scratch the surface. They're not going to go as deep as the commercial offerings, right?
Right.
That's true. I think if you're protecting your customer data, you want to look at a commercial vendor for this.
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Sweet. That will round it out for the news this week. Stay tuned. Some interviews coming up.